the United States, and high-speed rail. Name me a more agonizing story. While Japan started the concept, it was both they and many other countries, mostly in Europe, that advanced it to become the global zeitgeist, the kingslayer of the dominance of airlines, and a solution to many a transport woes of a nation, even if it is expensive to invest up front in, that we know and pretty much idolize today. However, there's a lot of things that people often miss with high-speed rail, and one aspect of the HSR story that is often missed is that, while Japan was the first to bring the concept to light with the famous Tokaido Shinkansen, a second country launched a high-speed train of their own not long after. And that country was the United States, and that train was the Metroliner. Launched to the public in 1969 as a highly anticipated, government-supported, ambitious attempt to save America's ailing passenger rail industry, it would come nowhere near the lofty expectations placed on it. And today, its legacy lives on as being either lambasted as a foolhardy idea, or, among those who have actually looked deeper into its past as I did, it's mourned as a fantastic idea that was completely undone by the process that created it. Well, as one could probably tell from that sentence alone, I'm firmly in the latter camp, and the later meteoric success of Amtrak's Acela Express beginning in the 2000s and continuing to this day on the exact same route that the Metroliner once served is really all the evidence I think most people should need on that point. But today, as the remnants of what was supposed to be one of America's grandest railroading triumphs that became arguably its worst defeat reach the end of their lives as humble coaching stock on Amtrak trains, and one car stands in a museum, it leads me, in no small part thanks to the encouragement of my good friend Classy Whale, to a question that I ended up going down a rabbit hole to answer. What if the Metroliner actually succeeded? Well, in order to understand how it's possible that the Metroliner could have succeeded, you have to understand the Metroliner project itself and why it failed in the first place. And to do that, one key thing has to be understood before you go much further. The Metroliner project as a whole was, first and foremost, a panic response. The launch of the Tokaido Shinkansen in Japan was basically the rail equivalent of what Sputnik was for the space race. However, whereas the implications of Sputnik were pretty well understood when it was launched in 1957 and America already had a response in the works, that wasn't the case for high-speed trains because not too many people at the time truly understood what significance a train going above 125 miles an hour on the regular would mean to a society. That is until Japan built it, and it fundamentally changed Japanese society for the better. And now, America was stuck behind the 8 ball, and a response was needed, quickly. In recent decades, we have achieved technological miracles in our transportation, but there is one great exception. We have airplanes which fly 3 times faster than sound. We have television cameras that are orbiting Mars. But we have the same tired and inadequate mass transportation between our towns and cities that we had 30 years ago. Today, as we meet here in this historic room where Abigail Adams hung out her washing, an astronaut can orbit the Earth faster than a man on the ground can get from New York to Washington. Yet the same science and technology which gave us our airplanes and space probes, I believe, could also give us better and faster and more economical transportation on the ground. And a lot of us need it more on the ground than we need it orbiting the Earth. So I hope this meeting this morning will provide a platform for us to get that kind of transportation. We must do it. We must start getting it now. In the past 15 years, travel between our cities has more than doubled. By 1985, only 20 years away, we will have 75 million more Americans in this country, and those 75 million will be doing a great deal more traveling. So we must find ways to move more people, to move these people faster, and to move them with greater comfort and with more safety. This bill is a first step towards accomplishing some of those objectives. President Lyndon B. Johnson, September 30th, 1965. Not moments before the president uttered those words, he signed into law the bill that he believed would be a first step towards accomplishing some of those objectives of carrying man from New York to Washington on the ground faster than an astronaut could orbit the Earth. That bill would come to be known as the High-Speed Ground Transportation Act of 1965. This bill in fact passed with bipartisan support, with a final vote in the House of Representatives of 409 to 23. American politicians and the public alike had seen what the Tokaido Shinkansen had achieved in its first full year of operation and realized just how far behind the eight ball America had truly fallen with mass transportation and particularly rail transportation. This bill was to be one of many in the Johnson administration's infrastructure initiatives as part of the Great Society program, though compared to many others, it was relatively smaller scale. But had it succeeded in its aims, it could have had the potential to be a transportation game changer like the Tokaido Shinkansen had been. At least, that was the theory. After the bill passed, the Department of Commerce was tasked with creating an office for the research and development program of a high-speed rail demonstration project. Yes, the Department of Commerce was given the task because the Department of Transportation didn't exist yet. But when the DOT was founded in 1967, it was handed over to them. And the whole affair started out with a big game of telephone regarding what to build in the first place for the project. On the one hand, you have the Commerce Department and later the DOT, and on the other, you have the railroad that owned the Northeast Corridor between New York and Washington, the line that was to be the demonstration ground, the Pennsylvania Railroad. And I say it was a game of telephone because there was a middleman as intermediary when it came to establishing what these trains would look like, and that was the rail consultancy firm Lewis T. Clodder and Associates, which was populated by rail industry veterans. Aside from being the general go-between, Clodder and Associates was to be the intermediary for several key disputes between the government and the Pennsylvania Railroad regarding the train's performance and appearance. In particular, there were two main disputes. The perhaps less significant one for this instance was if the electric rail cars that were to be developed were to be single-car units for greater flexibility, which was what the Pennsylvania Railroad wanted, or should they be four-car fixed-rake sets, which was what the Commerce Department wanted. This one was resolved with a compromise of having the Metroliners be made up of two-car permanently coupled sets, which could be built up into longer trains of 4, 6, and ideally 8 cars relatively easily while still being flexible for crews. But then there was the dispute that I argue was the first and foremost of three big problems that doomed the project to failure. The dispute on what the train's top speed should have been. The Pennsylvania Railroad wanted the top speed to be 125 miles per hour, so that they would have been a reasonable upgrade over their existing fleet of trains hauled by the 100 mile per hour rated GG1 electric locomotives from the 1930s, and a speed that would have put them pretty much on par with the original Zero Series Shinkansen bullet trains in Japan, which had a top service speed of 130 miles an hour. However, the government, in what I argue was a lizard brain moment and likely influenced by a certain someone, demanded that the top speed between 150 and 160 miles per hour to blow the Shinkansen out of the water. And unknowing of the hell they would unleash upon the project, they picked the higher top speed. This could very well be described as the original sin of the Metroliner project, since it put the performance targets way too high than was necessary or even reliably feasible with the technology and infrastructure of the time. I mean, sure, they could do it, but not without drawing enough electrical power to make the entire system groan or rip out the windows of commuter trains on existing tracks. Yes, that was a thing. Or even likely without causing severe discomfort to the passengers because of the massive hunting oscillation in the wheels. Bear in mind, this was a time just before Dr. Alan Wickens and his research team at British Rail cracked the code for making trains reliably go above 130 miles an hour with yaw dampers, which was the key breakthrough needed to make high-speed rail as we know it today reliably feasible, and would first come about in the form of a high-speed train with the prototypes of British Rail's unduly maligned APT tilting train project. But that wasn't available, and with the US DOT only starting its research into high-speed transportation, they couldn't really apply it in time either. And that was only made worse by the second massive problem with the Metroliner. This train was the biggest rush job in probably all of railroading history. To demonstrate this point, let's go over some timelines. The Tokaido Shinkansen had been envisioned as early as the mid-1930s, with land acquisition and early tunnel works taking place before World War II. Construction in earnest started in 1958, along with the development of the trains for the service, and it was completed in 1964. That's 6 years of time backed by massive industrial involvement and a government-backed national rail operator and structure. This was long before JR was privatized. This was plenty of time, not only to build a new rail line, but to test out the technology and the trains needed to make it work to its greatest strengths. In France, the development of the TGV took even longer, with the TGV starting its development process in 1967 and launching into public service in 1981 after 14 years, after all the trial and error of finding out how to high-speed train was complete. For the Metroliner, though, the timeline initially had a hard and fast deadline of 1968. It was started in late 1965, remember. Less than 3 years, to match what took other countries nearly a decade or more to make. As it turned out, the Americans couldn't fast-track it and expect it to work as well as the Japanese had. But the obvious question remains, why was it so rushed? 2 words: political capital. The rush timeline was influenced by President Lyndon B. Johnson himself, whose administration set the project on a 1968 deadline so that the Metroliner could be a political talking point in the 1968 presidential election. Perhaps the moment that deadline was put out to the builders on the Pennsylvania Railroad, panic set in immediately, because doing this and making a train that would, work to the proposed specs was borderline impossible with experimental technology. That's not to say they didn't try though, and in April 1967, they had a demonstrator unit that was essentially made up of souped up Silverliner 2 EMU cars for commuter trains on SEPTA with a slab front on them that kind of looks like someone just stuck a fridge on it. But it did 156 miles an hour on a test run, and it proved that it was physically possible to achieve these speeds, even if the electrical grid was screaming internally at the thought of it alone, and I'm certain the staff on board were not particularly comfortable during that experience. And in September of 1967, the first production Metroliner sets rolled out of Bud's famous Red Lion plant in North Philadelphia, with an initial aim to have a service begin in some capacity 2 months later in November. But initial testing would find one fault after another, particularly with the propulsion systems, excessive energy draw, pantographs bouncing off the overhead wires causing short circuits, and perhaps the most famous flaw of all, that whole pressure drop from a passing Metroliner ripping out the windows of commuter trains that it passed by. This saw the first of many delays of entry into service. The issues that could have been addressed took months to do so, and eventually some could not have been fixed. But at least there was one saving grace, and that was a slightly extended timeline to work things out due to the political pressure on the project lifting somewhat. Why was that? Well, you know how I said Lyndon Johnson wanted the Metroliner as political capital for his re-election bid in the 1968 election? Well, ultimately, on March 31st, 1968, Johnson announced that he would not seek re-election. Largely because of this whole kerfuffle in Vietnam, it must be said. That gave the Metroliner project some leeway to work out more of the problems, but with many of the sets now being built and the delays already stretching out over a year, a disgrace for a project like this in those days, the pressure was still intense even without the president's eye on things. Eventually, on January 16, 1969, the Metroliner, operated by the Pennsylvania Railroad's short-lived successor Penn Central, began revenue service. And while these trains were clocked as fast as 164 miles an hour under testing, the Federal Railroad Administration restricted the sets to 120 in regular service, largely owing to the colossal power draw from the electrical infrastructure that the Metroliners needed to go any faster, as well as the track conditions generally on the Northeast Corridor at that time. Oh, and the whole sucking up the windows on commuter trains thing, that was still an issue too. At the same time, the trains were also limited to no longer than 6 cars, due to 8-car sets taking up so much power that they caused circuit breaker trips and catenary power to fail altogether. Overall, while the trains certainly took the public's interest and brought a lot of business travel back to the rails, the main cause of their downfall was evident from the start: their horrendous reliability, which was caused by 2 main reasons. The fast timeline was the first one, but the other one was the fact that the companies responsible for building the trains, Budd, General Electric, and Westinghouse, were woefully unprepared for such a project. The Budd company may be praised today for the durability of their products after 50 years of hard use or more, and back when they first arrived in the rail industry in the 1930s, they were praised for their lightweight rolling stock. But the problem was, they hadn't really worked to expand on that lightness of their products for 30 years after. And when it came to building a high-speed train, their favorite material to use, stainless steel, would prove itself to be the main reason why the Metroliners were way too heavy to be an efficient high-speed train compared to being made of aluminum, which pretty much every proper high-speed train is made out of, even back then. But that was kind of small potatoes when compared to the problems that GE and Westinghouse had with their development of the train's electrical and control systems. That's a whole rabbit hole to go down in its own right, but both GE and Westinghouse struggled to create electrical systems efficient enough to operate a train as fast as the Metroliner, both with the rapidly evolving changes in the realm of electronics and computers at the time, and the fact that the Metroliner was a generally lower priority project, both from the companies involved as well as the government itself. When the main business of the day is defense contracts, stuff like this tends to slip down the pipeline of resource priority. I would argue that it wouldn't have needed to require the same level of resources going into aircraft programs at the time, but input from that may have been worth it, because it did actually happen with the Metroliner project, and when it did, it worked. During the train's development in 1966, Budd recruited John W. Marchetti, a renowned engineer who was a pioneer of the development of radar, and thus the electromechanical systems that controlled them, to provide input in the development of the control systems of the train. And by all accounts, his work helped with allowing Budd gain skills in this new realm of the rail industry in the world of electronics. But also by all accounts, Marchetti's contribution was relatively small, and the man alone wouldn't have been enough to save the project from the lack of resources, human, technical, and time alike, that would doom the Metroliner to being a demonstrator project forced into the role of being a groundbreaking step forward for passenger rail. While the Metroliner would be a success in winning passengers back to the rails, with a 2.5-hour express service between Washington and New York coming into effect just as the service was taken over by the newly created Amtrak in 1971, and it would be one of the services that Amtrak would see working profits right from the start, the Metroliner trains themselves would be cursed with unreliability for their entire working lives. A very expensive rebuild program in the mid-1970s, while seeing improved performance and reliability, would be prohibitive to implement for the entire fleet. There was even thoughts at first of deactivating the Metroliners and have them locomotive hauled by GG1s, but this was rejected quickly purely because the Metroliners were the newest equipment on Amtrak's roster, and so deactivating them would be a PR disaster. While Amtrak initially considered a larger order of second-generation Metroliner 2 sets in the late 1970s, the solution that they turned to would be old-fashioned locomotive-hauled trains. The coaches for these trains, based on the Metroliner's body shell and the superb comfort and speed they presented, would come to be known as the Amfleet cars, which are still the backbone of Amtrak's intercity services to this day, 50 years later. As the old saying goes, Bud don't break. As for the locomotives pulling them, after the failed General Electric E60 locomotives, trials with locomotives from France and Sweden would see the Swedish SJ RC4 class electric locomotives picked as the basis for the new power of the Metroliner and other corridor services, the AEM-7, which would see entry into service in 1979. The AEM-7 and Amfleet combo was a rousing success and would see the original Metroliner trains out of action on the service in 1981. Some of them continued to be used on the Keystone service between Philadelphia and Harrisburg, but their reliability continued to be a problem, with the Keystone becoming locomotive hauled itself in 1988. Finally, 25 of the Metroliners were depowered and put to work as cab control cars, a task that 15 of the remaining cars still do to this day on the Keystone service, the Hartford Line Shuttle, and the Valley Flyer. And one unconverted Metroliner car, number 860, is at the Railroad Museum of Pennsylvania in Strasburg, Pennsylvania. Also, the Metroliner was not only the basis of the Amfleet, which were great, but also the basis of the SPV 2000, a self-propelled diesel rail car that was less great. Your day will come later. So, a rush job run on legacy infrastructure and was set to be way more ambitious than it really had any business being. Is it any wonder why the Metroliner failed? And is it any wonder that America's high-speed rail ambitions would only start to be realized with the launch of the Acela in 2000, 40 years later? And so, the question remains, what alternate timeline could realistically see the Metroliner succeed and America's high-speed rail ambitions be met way sooner than what we're seeing now? So, let's look and see what I think is a plausible, possible timeline of how that could have succeeded. Let's have a look. Well, with that, let's get to the key divergence in the timeline, and that goes back to the concept stage, particularly the discussion between the government and the Pennsylvania Railroad as to the proposed performance targets. Instead of the DOT's proposed 150 to 160 miles per hour, Clodder and Associates sides with the Pennsylvania Railroad and picks a lower top speed target, but instead of 125 miles an hour, they bump it up to 130 to placate the government and put the speed on par with the Zero Series Shinkansen. However, the Johnson administration still wants to see something tangible in time for the election. And with this, Clodder, after much discussion with Bud and the Pennsy, hatch a compromise plan. The overall project will be on a much longer timeline, but a fully functioning fleet of 6 prototype 2-car sets will be built to both trial the technology and show off to the public and the politicians. After the initial tests, they will be fully decked out for revenue service, and a trial period of the trains will be run when they're completed. In the background, though, the real project would work out the kinks they find in the prototypes and lay out a game plan for the service and the infrastructure. The first prototypes, 3 each powered by Westinghouse and General Electric traction equipment, roll out of the Red Lion plant in October 1967 with a similar slab-fronted and rounded body design as the Metroliners of our timeline, and they begin their testing runs. While several teething issues with the propulsion systems were experienced, the lower performance requirements lead to these problems being less severe and less numerous than the Metroliners in actuality. Speeds of 130 miles an hour are reached and even exceeded, and the issue of the Metroliners sucking out windows out of old commuter trains still happen. But even still, the testing goes smoother than before due to the easier goals to reach, and a promo run is scheduled for the 4th of July weekend in 1968. After some last-minute compatibility issues between the GE and Westinghouse cars are resolved, the first press run of the Metroliner, run in a 6-car formation due to catenary concerns with 8-car trains, is held between Washington and New York on July 6, 1968, with outgoing US President Lyndon B. Johnson arriving to see the train off. Due to an engagement he had later in the day, he doesn't ride the train himself, although the first ever Secretary of Transportation, Alan S. Boyd, does ride it, and he's overall impressed by the speed and comfort of the first-class amenities the trains are decked out in, including first-class parlor cars and a modern but practical restaurant car for food service. Overall, the run went about as smooth as it could have gone. The TV news cameras tout the trains as the start of a new golden age of rail, though the nickname of the flying fridge also comes out of it immediately. And also, it was made clear that this was only the beginning of their story, which is even more successful ultimately in drumming up the hype for what the production trains would look like. Even still, 2 trips a day are planned between Washington and New York City, run as 4-car sets, and 2 are kept as spares. They officially carry revenue passengers under the Metroliner moniker starting in August, and were really popular with the public, and many business passengers were clamoring for seats of each run of the day. It was clear that if the service was expanded, it was going to be a hit. However, in order to do that, 2 key problems needed to be addressed: the outdated electrical infrastructure of the route, and the excessive energy consumption that the trains required, which itself was caused by a key problem: their stainless steel construction, which made them too heavy to run at high speeds efficiently. This would be resolved by building the new trains out of aluminum, but would also require Bud to learn how to use the material to its best strengths. After a bit of searching, John Marchetti sends a letter to Bud that he may know of a company that could help them out on this front. That company is Lockheed. The aircraft manufacturer known for making America's first jet fighter and many military and civilian aircraft since have expressed interest in ground transportation, in particular with monorails, most famously being the initial winning bidder for the Seattle monorail for the 1962 World's Fair before being snubbed at the last minute. Perhaps a bit bitter about this, Lockheed wants to see success in this field, and seeing the early publicity about the Metroliner project, they get into contact with Bud about providing their aviation expertise to help them with the production of the project. Bud and the government, particularly the new transportation secretary under the Nixon administration, John Volpe, are eager to see it. However, Lockheed has a caveat. They only want to work with General Electric when it comes to a traction equipment provider. GE has a strong working relationship with Lockheed, having built jet engines for their aircraft in recent years. And to make their case, they point out to Volpe and other members of the Nixon administration that Westinghouse's equipment had been far less reliable in the course of the development. However, Westinghouse already has an order on the table to make the traction equipment for a dedicated fleet of Metroliner sets for the Silverliner intercity service between Philadelphia and Harrisburg, which at the time was chartered by SEPTA and run by Penn Central. Eventually, after the state of Pennsylvania gets involved in the matter against Lockheed, they relent, and Westinghouse stays on, though particularly for the SEPTA order. By the end of the decade, concept arts are shown for the trains, looking much more streamlined and modern, and the people get excited to see the result. And that's a good thing given the contemporary collapse of passenger rail. Of course, the Rail Passenger Service Act of 1970 still happens in this timeline, and the prospect of the Metroliner project makes the Nixon administration a bit less reticent to sign it into law. A bit. Amtrak starts operation on May 1st, 1971, and takes over existing former Penn Central services on the Northeast Corridor, including the demonstration Metroliner, now into its 3rd year. Issues with the traction equipment and manufacturing are evaluated for the production models, and Lockheed works with Bud in the art of building the trains out of aluminum. The first pre-production prototype Metroliner, a semi-permanently coupled 6-car EMU, rolls out of the Red Lion plant in February 1972 and begins testing, being the first trains ever fully decked out in Amtrak's Phase 1 livery. And also, building off of the excitement of the space race in recent years, each train set is given a name and named after a famous US astronaut, with the first Metroliner set being named John Glenn. Oh yeah, it's also worth noting that the DOT ultimately won out on the length of the sets, particularly as Amtrak gave approval for the idea. The initial batch would be for 20 sets, each with a first-class car in a parlor car configuration, a cafe car, and 4 business class cars. As like the Metroliner and later the Acela that happened in our timeline, this was made to be a premier option for business travelers. These sets would be a major improvement even over the prototypes, due not only to evaluation on the prototypes as they continued service, but also taking interest in developments overseas, most notably the yaw damper improvements that British Rail have been incorporating into their high-speed train project, the APT tilting train. It was this refinement in particular that led everyone to realize that the Metroliner could in fact be a lot faster than its target specifications without hurting the electrical infrastructure as much as the prototypes did. On November 14, 1972, an ambitious trial run with a Metroliner set was undertaken to see how fast it could go. Run between Rahway, New Jersey and Levittown, Pennsylvania, production Metroliner set number 9, the Buzz Aldrin, reaches a top speed of 168 miles an hour as it passed through Princeton Junction. It wasn't enough to break the overall speed record for American rails at 183 miles an hour, set in 1966 by this thing, but it made clear that this high-speed train could be something special indeed. As much as the DOT's higher-ups wanted to see this mean that the train's speed limit in service could be increased to 150, Amtrak and the FRA bring them down to earth and keep the projected service speed of 130, but teased the public that work was underway to make them faster for the future. With this PR coup, Amtrak launches the Metroliner service on February 12, 1973 to incredible fanfare. These streamlined, futuristic trains, which are actually streamlined in this case rather than having a slab front, draw a lot more attention, and they start service with 10 round trips a day. Every train for the opening week of service is booked solid well in advance. The Lockheed Bud Metroliners begin their regular service, and they were everything the public expected and more. Luxurious, comfortable, and above all, fast. Deceptively fast. With an unupgraded Northeast Corridor, the fastest services, later known as the Metroliner Expresses, will be able to run the route from Washington to New York in 2 hours and 25 minutes, with the only intermediate stop being in Philadelphia. Most other services do the journey in about 2 hours 50 minutes, with stops in Baltimore, Wilmington, Trenton, and Newark. Now, during this time, as the Metroliners start to get into their stride, competitors to the Metroliner start to emerge. The United Aircraft Corporation developed their Turbo Train, a high-speed tilting train run on gas turbine technology rather than electric power, as a way of delivering high-speed rail performance on existing rights-of-way. However, while top speeds of 170 miles per hour are reached, technically beating the Metroliner per raw speed achieved, the passive tilt system it uses proves to be highly problematic, even in its most successful market in Canada, where it is trialed as a higher speed passenger service, the Turbo, between Toronto and Quebec City. This was not helped by the fact that because this and this still happened in this timeline because geopolitics doesn't care, and therefore the 1973 and 1979 oil crises still happen, gas turbines rapidly fall out of favor due to their horrendous fuel consumption problems, and Canada starts to look at the Metroliner and another project in the US that's starting to take shape for their high-speed rail ambitions. Westinghouse, still a bit bitter about their initial treatment by Lockheed, start to look elsewhere for future rail projects after their order of 8 4-car Metroliner sets for SEPTA were completed, which are launched in March of 1974. In 1971, Westinghouse reaches out to Rohr Industries, who are also working on the first-generation subway cars for both the Washington Metro and BART. Rohr is skeptical at first, but with interest starting in their home state of California for high-speed rail of their own, Westinghouse and Rohr eventually agreed to propose to the California State Legislature the concept for a high-speed rail line between San Francisco and Los Angeles. Initially, due to apprehension to such an idea, particularly the cost and politics of it all, and because of major apprehension by then-Governor Ronald Reagan, the idea gains momentum with the public following the splash success of the Metroliner and the 1973 oil crisis. And eventually, the California High-Speed Rail Agency is established in 1977 under Governor Jerry Brown. Yes, that Jerry Brown. And with the success of the Metroliner becoming more evident by the day, this Metroliner West project, as it's initially known, gains political support in both California and to a lesser extent at the federal level. Eventually, a deal is brokered for a funding split between California and the feds for a high-speed rail project, so long as the service is run by Amtrak, which is amplified by a PR campaign put out by Westinghouse that correctly points out the inefficiency and ineffectiveness of California's road construction binge in the last few decades. Construction of the line, which for political reasons runs through the Central Valley rather than the I-5 corridor, starts in 1980. And after several delays and also several threats at pulled funding by the administration of now President Ronald Reagan in the early years of his term, Reagan eventually relents on the project, and in fact, he arrives for the inauguration of the new high-speed line in a ceremony at Los Angeles Union Station on September 9, 1990. During testing of the new line in 1989, the Rohr Westinghouse high-speed trains, dubbed the Speedliners and built at Rohr's factory in Chula Vista, California, break the record for fastest train in America, with a top speed of 209 miles an hour being clocked between Bakersfield and Fresno. In service, these trains will be limited to 180 miles an hour and complete the San Francisco to Los Angeles run in 3 hours, twice as fast as driving. And that's driving on a good day. And the track geometry could one day see trains run at 220 miles an hour when they're capable of that reliably. Needless to say, the Speedliners and their service, known as CalSpeed, are a massive hit, and interest in the success of both of them and the Lockheed Budd Metroliners on the Northeast Corridor start to spread. During the 1980s, however, the cuts to research sectors by the Reagan administration still happen, including some aspects of high-speed rail research being taken out of the hands of the DOT and essentially moved into the hands of private companies, with the DOT focusing on safety standards for rail, leading to a slowdown and relatively little improvement. However, with the government-owned Amtrak and the private companies such as Rohr, Budd, GE, and Westinghouse riding on the success of these projects, much of this knowledge is kept in-house, and in a back-channel way thanks to their government contracts, they, along with Lockheed, retain most of the current knowledge that help with future projects. In the meantime, other states and even other countries look at the US's burgeoning high-speed rail industry for input on their own projects. Prospective routes in Illinois, Pennsylvania, New York State, and Florida start to gain political support, especially with the development of the Speedliner project and the continuing success of the Metroliner. Texas also mulls one for a time before intense lobbying from Southwest Airlines sees it falter on the House floor. But the big thing that moves forward in the 1980s is further electrification of routes to allow Metroliner trains to run. In 1986, a proposal to extend electrification on the Northeast Corridor, which by this point had mostly been transferred to Amtrak ownership, from New Haven to Boston gets serious consideration, but it's delayed until 1989 to start construction due to financing constraints and political disinterest. Eventually, the wires are put up between New Haven and Boston by 1991, coupled with a full upgrade of the Northeast Corridor featuring curve straightening, fixing of several bottlenecks, and upgrading catenary to constant tension systems, coupled with modifications made to the Metroliner trains to make them run on multiple voltages. Other services on the Northeast Corridor by this time are run by new 4-axle electric locomotives built by GE, essentially taking their successful E44 framework as the basis and creating a much faster passenger variant capable of 110 miles an hour, hauling coaches based on the shell of the Metroliner cars. These same body shells also form the basis of a diesel-powered variant of the train intended for non-electrified routes. Budd and GE's diesel locomotive division present a concept for such a train and are quickly joined by Rohr Industries, who partner with EMD for their demonstration of the concept. After demonstration runs held by the two trains, both of them essentially being dual power car train sets capable of 125 miles an hour, not dissimilarly to the highly successful British Rail HST sets run across the country. In the end, Amtrak essentially calls it a wash, and orders both of them, with state departments of transportation picking the ones they like the best for services backed by the state governments. California, Illinois, Michigan, and Wisconsin go for the Roar EMD design known as the Turboliner 3, having this continue the naming convention of the Turboliner trains, part built by Roar for these services in the 1970s. Meanwhile, New York, Pennsylvania, Washington, Oregon, and Florida buy the Bud GE design, known officially as the AMT 125 and known to the public as the American Flyers. These trains are successful overall due to their comfort and performance improvements, but the use of freight rights of way initially held the trains back. Their success, however, leads the state governments to start making improvements to these routes, with them steadily becoming more reliable and quicker, though it is a slow affair due to resistance from certain politicians and the freight railroads. However, even though the Metroliners are holding up reasonably well for their age, a replacement needs to be considered. Amtrak puts out a tender for new high-speed trains, and they're open to ideas for both power car hauled trains and multiple units, seeing the success of the TGV in France as a reason to keep their options open. Bud, which by this time partners with Bombardier to expand their production capabilities, and again partnered with GE, make a prototype for their second-generation Metroliner, a 9-car electric multiple unit. And Roar and Westinghouse make a 10-car set with 2 power cars and 8 coaches, making what was essentially an electric variant of the Turboliner 3. Ultimately, Amtrak chooses both, again, but for different reasons. Amtrak chose the Bud EMU, known as the Pioneer 4 internally within Bud, as the next generation Metroliner, which was designed for a top service speed of 150 miles an hour, but the potential to reach 180 if track conditions in the future permit. The same performance was reached by the Roar design, known internally as the Electroliner, and this was chosen to be the replacement for the locomotive-hauled trains making up other corridor services, with the sets being able to switch to diesel Turboliner 3 locomotives to continue their services. This would coincide with a consolidation of the train services on the corridor from numerous different train names to one single moniker, the Northeast Intercity Service, making the service more approachable for the continually growing market of riders. It would also be in the 1990s that Bud, Roar, and several international builders make new families of trains to be built for commuter services throughout the 90s and 2000s, with Bud selling electric and diesel multiple unit commuter trains to SEPTA, the MTA, NJT, and the MBTA, whereas Roar sells new trains to MARC, Caltrain, which was electrified alongside California High-Speed Rail, and Metrolink, which electrifies the San Bernardino line and Ventura County lines in 1995 and 1997 respectively. At this point, the American rolling stock scene is respected, with American companies bidding on high-speed rail projects around the world in Canada, Taiwan, South Korea, and Turkey. Canada and Turkey build their high-speed lines with American technology, whereas Taiwan goes with Japanese Shinkansen tech, and Korea develops their own, albeit with both American and French input, something which their original trains for the KTX system show, as they're described by railroad analysts like if a Roar Electroliner and a TGV had a baby. Some state DOTs look into their own expansion plans a lot more seriously in the mid-2000s, but are initially dissuaded due to political and economic factors. However, in 2009, in the aftermath of the Great Recession, the Obama administration grants funding for states to develop their own high-speed and higher-speed rail projects, as what almost happened in our timeline. This time, however, instead of Ohio and Florida rejecting them, they, alongside Illinois, jump at the chance, as their Amtrak services with their fast trains are seeing continued rising patronage and public support. Wisconsin is offered it as well, but declines, and instead the allocated funding goes to Texas, who finally shake the airline influence and take advantage of the deal, despite the backlash from certain constituents, in order to build a high-speed rail line between Dallas and Houston as the first part of a network connecting the Texas Triangle. This has been slow to materialize, however, due to political meddling. In the meantime, California expands their high-speed rail lines from LA to San Diego, which opens in 2015. This is complemented by new custom-built trains made by Roar, which in a few years becomes a subsidiary of General Dynamics. A future link to Sacramento is planned, as is a joint effort with the Nevada DOT to expand to Las Vegas. Washington State also wants in, but the quick snap up of funding available and a initially lukewarm reception to it at home sees them go empty-handed. New trains from Roar and Bud, the latter of which absorbs Bombardier's rail division in 2018, make their appearance on the national network, competing well against foreign equipment from Siemens, Alstom, and later Stadler, leading to a pretty diverse rolling stock makeup for the country. Speaking of Bud, they, with input from Alstom, create the first tilting train with their third-generation Metroliner set, the Bud Alstom Pioneer 5, which is a radical departure from their previous offerings of EMUs, with coaches designed by Bud and a power car configuration championed by Alstom, albeit with GE electrical equipment, in order to fit the tilting mechanism that they desired. Roar also presents a concept of a power car-based train set, but they lose out on the bid. However, these see a successful buyer in the form of Canada, whose high-speed rail service, known as the Lynx, is proving to be a major success in its own right, and is being extended from its current western terminus at London to Windsor, which would fully open up the Quebec City-Windsor corridor to high-speed rail by 2025. Both types of trains would enter service in the US and Canada in 2022, after a one-year delay of the former. Things slowed down a bit during the first Trump administration as high-speed rail development is taken up as a part of the culture wars of the period, in particular regarding the rural-urban divide. This will remain the status quo through the end of the 2020s at the end of the second Trump administration, when these concerns are finally brought to serious discussion. For you see, during this whole time, and despite the success that these individual projects have had over the years, there was never a chance to actually coordinate things deeper. And instead of being a public good for everybody, high-speed rail becomes seen as something that only the city people have the chance to use effectively. While it is indeed impressive, with some American trains able to hit 220 miles per hour now, able to run the DC to New York run in under 2 hours on the fastest schedules, and indeed some opponents of their investment openly brag about their successes online, that benefit came at the expense of the betterment of a lot of services that would be useful to more people beyond the cities. It even came at the expense of some projects that may have been beneficial to the cities themselves, such as funding that would have gone to a proposed light rail network in Detroit going towards improving Michigan's intercity passenger network instead. Optimization of services on corridors don't happen either, preventing both regional services and intercity trains from working well together, causing delays that consistently hurt travel times. During this time, advocates, mostly from the Northeast, seeing the chaos and delays incurred on the Northeast corridor due to a lack of coordination, the chaos of the infrastructure upgrades of that time due to political meddling, as well as concerns raised in the 2020s, put together a vision for what could possibly solve this and bring the benefits of passenger rail to everybody, not just the high-speed network. Nationalization of the entire rail network may have been the best starting point to the best outcome, but considering the political climate, it's a bit too ambitious for them. But there is one idea that comes to be settled on: interstate compacts for passenger rail service. Reading through stories of how rail services have improved for more people abroad, it's clear that railroads need to be democratized as much as they are nationalized. And interstate compacts for passenger rail would allow state governments and the public to elect people onto the compact, which would coordinate services and improvements, while at the same time allowing local authorities who become members of the compact to have a local say over their own investments as well. On top of that, each member would create, if they hadn't already, a passenger rail authority within their state's DOT, as well as a statutory corporation tasked with running services within a state that falls outside of an intercity type of train, which finally gets an actual definition. It also gives the state DOTs or the compact itself greater power in their ability to purchase rights of way from freight companies and increased ability to command resources to build new ones, which is to say they get any sort of ability at all. In early 2030, after years of deliberation, mostly behind closed doors politically until 2029, it is decided that the states of Virginia, West Virginia, Maryland, Delaware, Pennsylvania, New Jersey, New York, Connecticut, Rhode Island, Massachusetts, Vermont, New Hampshire, and Maine, as well as the District of Columbia, will be allowed to join the first of these interstate compacts, the Northeast Passenger Rail Alliance, which eventually passes Congress and is signed into law. Every state but West Virginia and New Hampshire join on day one, though West Virginia, in the midst of an effort to rebuild itself during this time, is eventually talked into joining, and New Hampshire does so, albeit reluctantly, soon after. In the following months, new statutory companies are created to organize and run services, and many a call is being made to train manufacturers, including Budd, Rohr, and many other builders, for what is likely to be a busy rail equipment market, and perhaps the most radical change in the way America sees its railroads since their inception gets underway. All thanks to one possible change that could have been made to America's first high-speed train to make it a success. But that's just a theory. As demonstrated with this alternate history, the Metroliner is agonizing to me. It's a great example of the butterfly effect and how one planning mistake made in the 60s led to lost opportunities years and decades later. But even still, even in this idealized timeline I've laid out, it's not a silver bullet. In this timeline, the development of high-speed rail is fragmented, and while successful where it does exist, it's difficult for those interested in building new lines to still do so. The Northeast US becomes an even stronger and interconnected mega region than it is now. The major metro areas, while still having issues, find these services indispensable, and cities like Baltimore and New Haven are able to seize more opportunities thanks to high-speed transport. Amtrak is in a better position overall with its profitable high-speed services, but Amtrak, while popular, is still divisive for its seeming lack of ability to improve services beyond the high-speed networks, at least to a major degree. So that brings us back to our timeline, and one thing you may have noticed is one thing that doesn't get said enough when it comes to the future we want and need to see for our transportation. High-speed rail is great, and it's indeed necessary, but it's only ever one part of the wider things we need to do to make our transport genuinely better. It can't be just one thing. That's not even how countries that have great high-speed systems work. Not even China, which is known for building thousands upon thousands of kilometers of high-speed rail. They've improved their conventional and commuter stuff too, and they've built a lot of metros. As demonstrated with the timeline I've put out here today, we've lived in a world where it's easy to spend money on major projects, but the things that don't go considered very often, such as the very structure of the industry in question, are left in the dust. And I get it. Change of that scale is scary, but it's not only possible, it's needed. We know full well that we can't keep moving around in the way we do today, even those that will say otherwise. And even if we were to build a nationwide network of high-speed railways, it's just going to come with its own failures if we don't lay out a structure to expand passenger services to places that often don't warrant a high-speed line. This is not like the interstate highway system where you're just building superhighways. You have to focus on the equivalent of the local roads as well. In the timeline I laid out, we had the domestic train builders that we've lost in our timeline, and they're strong and respected internationally. But it's not like we lack the ability to build trains in the US. The builders may be part of foreign multinational corporations, but they build the equipment to American spec designs and in the US. The main thing that needs to change is structure, and one difference to a high-speed rail project in the 60s doesn't change that on its own. Indeed, the last time the structure of the rail industry at large in the US faced a serious change was in the 1970s with the creation of both Amtrak and Conrail. But more than anything else, in my opinion, people simply don't know what the future would look like if changes this big were to happen. Or indeed, if a high-speed rail line or just a regular passenger line gets built outside of the Northeast. Or even if a train service is brought back to places that haven't seen them in decades in general, especially to smaller towns and cities, which in this timeline have still been neglected, perhaps even worse so than they are today. And that leads me to one of the main reasons why high-speed rail has struggled in the US in general. There's no policy framework for them. And rail in transit is a part of our society that needs that in order to succeed. This is the reason why highways ran rampant in the 20th century. The Federal Aid Highway Act created and still maintains, because it's still on the books, a highway system that we're seeing today spanning the nation, and still attempting to expand even beyond the point of reason. But when a country uses that to develop a passenger and freight rail network made to be the future backbone of their transportation system, it has a much stronger chance of success. Just ask China, India, Japan, or Switzerland. And really, the High-Speed Ground Transportation Act of 1965 was very much not that. It was just made as a demonstrator project for a country that, while wanting to match what Japan had achieved, was deeply skeptical of the project's effect if it had succeeded, not helped by the fact that a lot of the funding that could have gone to such a vision was committed to the Vietnam War and defense spending in general. But today, as America steadily rides trains more and more and realizes that good public transportation is the fix to many of our transportation and even some of our overall societal woes, it's getting closer to that time where creating such a framework can beget the creation of a high-speed network that we have always dreamed of, as well as just having more trains and even buses in general serve far more places than they do today, many of which used to have them. But that's another big video that I'm going to be working on. In my personal estimation, if you want to get an idea of what that should look like, I highly recommend checking out the book How the Railways Will Fix the Future, written by professional guy who designs railways for a living and fellow YouTuber Gareth Dennis. To me, this is kind of a visionary's handbook for a railroad network that Americans want and need for our future. And also, definitely check out his channel and his podcast, Rail Natter, if you haven't already. It's always a great listen. Prepare to learn a lot of Britishisms in the process too. And also be annoyed at how Britain screwed up its railways as badly as they did, and still does screw them up.
Also, should note, I'm not sponsored, I just think this is a really good book. Check it out. And also check out Garrett's podcast too. Good stuff.
In the end, while the overarching issue still remains, even in this ideal timeline I've laid out, it shows just how pivotal one decision could be to the success or failure of the whole project, or indeed a country's transportation future, and how when one day we start to tackle the structural challenges of our rail and transport system, it's highly important we plan it and consult on it well right from the start, for the sake of the needed future of how we get around.